Hi everybody, welcome back to Newton Community Farms YouTube channel. My name's Hope and it's Wednesday, so we're going to be talking about gardening. Today we're actually going to take our lesson outside of the learning garden and check out a little bit more of the farm itself and learn about the sustainability practices that we adopt here in our growing system. And I think before we dive in, it's important to ask why talk about sustainable farming practices on a home gardening focused show. And I think the way I see it is that if folks are growing food for themselves and their families, they probably care about their own health. And if you care about your own health, the next kind of level, if you zoom out from that, is caring about environmental health, because that always boils down to our health as well. They're very connected. And sustainable farming has so much to do with nutrient-dense crops and feeding communities and personal health, but it also has a lot to do with environmental health and taking care of the soil and the air and all of that ecosystem. So we're going to talk about three particular things that we do here at Newton Community Farm, both in the learning garden and on the production side of things. And we're going to talk about how we can adapt those practices to a small garden at home. So it will be relevant to what you're growing and the direction that you want to move in if you've been thinking about how to make it more sustainable. So first stop is still in the learning garden, so we'll move over this way. And if you've watched our episodes before, you've probably seen some of this material that we lay on the ground beneath certain crops. So right here, you can see, so these are tomatoes. And tomatoes are in the ground for a pretty long time. And tomatoes also really like heat. So a lot of farms will lay black plastic on the ground. It not only locks in heat for these heat-loving plants, but it keeps weeds down so that there's a lot less work to do in the soil around these plants. You can kind of plant them, let them grow, and you don't have to do too much maintenance. So this looks like plastic, and it's actually made from corn gluten, which I don't know what that looks like or feels like or smells like before it's turned into this material, but it feels like a really thin plastic shopping bag or something, but it's actually made of corn gluten. It does the same thing as black plastic would do, which is lock in heat for the plants and kill weeds that would otherwise compete with the plants. But different from black plastic, when this material breaks down, it ends up putting organic matter back into the soil. So at the end of the season, when we turn this bed over and the crops are taken out and we're getting ready for winter, this will just be worked into the soil, this corn gluten material, and it breaks down pretty quickly and it adds nutrients into the soil. So it's kind of replenishing some of the vital stuff in the soil that we've taken out by nature of planting a crop in it, and that crop requires some nutrients. If you're using black plastic on a farm or a home garden, that material is a lot more to work with at the end of the season because you do have to take it out, whereas this can just be left in the soil. And typically black plastic will break down into little bits of petroleum, which doesn't add much to the soil comparatively. So this is a really good option for a farm like ours, where we benefit from using something like this. And this can definitely be adopted for a home gardener. It, like I said, really cuts down on the kind of work that you need to do. So because it's so hot underneath this black material, no weeds are going to grow, and they don't have anywhere to pop up through anyways. So it's a lot less work for me in this space to not have to weed this consistently. So, you know, if you're gardening and you have a busy lifestyle, if you have a full-time job, this can save time and help it feel a little bit less overwhelming in your garden, if that's an experience that you have with keeping up with all of the tasks that a garden entails. So yeah, that's an option sustainability-wise and just kind of efficiency-wise. And depending on how much space you have, it can come in handy. So we're gonna take it out onto the farm now. And our next stop is out in this direction, and we're going to be talking about, things are growing really wildly on this side of the garden. So, do you want to walk in front of me? So we're going to talk a little bit about tilling and what that means and how it impacts farming and gardening and where it lies on the sustainability spectrum. So tilling is basically, this is kind of nice. Tilling is basically any soil disruption. So anything from spading to plowing. And typically tilling involves disrupting the soil in a way that can damage the communities of microorganisms that tend to really help plant health. So the more you plow a bed, this applies a little bit more to farming, but the more you plow a bed, the more you break up that soil, you end up depleting the nutrients from that soil. And that means it can hold fewer nutrients, it can nourish your crop a little bit less, and it typically has a harder time holding on to water. There's a lot more runoff, and then there's a lot more erosion. So on the big picture of environmental health, the more you plow your soil, the more you plow a field, the more you're depleting that soil. So every year here at the farm we do rotating no-till beds. And you're looking at a few no-till tomatoes right now. And a no-till bed is a bed that hasn't been disturbed at all. So it hasn't been plowed and it hasn't been spaded. And all that we did to plant these tomatoes was use a post driver to open up these holes to put the transplants in, put in a little bit of compost, and then patted them back into the hole, drove these stakes in, and now they're happily growing in soil that hasn't been disturbed. So this year, these beds are here. Next year, they'll be in a different spot on the farm, which means that a different area of the farm gets to rest its soil every year. And that's beneficial for microorganisms kind of building up strength. And yeah, it's a way to rest the soil. And it's one of the many ways that we use to rest the soil. And when we do till at all, it's a low impact machinery. It's called a spader. And it's much more forgiving than a plow or something that really tends to pulverize the soil. And that's how we get our soil to be healthy and to be able to support nutrient dense crops. So we talked about tomatoes last week, and this is a whole nother type. We talked about field tomatoes, we talked about hoop house tomatoes, and no-till tomatoes are a whole nother variety. And they're still gonna be just as happy as the other tomatoes. They have their soil, like I said, they have a little bit of compost, and yeah, it's a good way to take care of the land, not disrupting it consistently. And the way that can be applied to a home gardener is, depending on the scale of your growing operation, you may use some kind of machinery. You may just use your hands and a shovel, but there are ways to fully go no-till or go kind of a minimal till. So another way to reduce the amount of disruption that you're causing in your soil is to do something like broad forking, which is a pretty forgiving method of loosening up the soil. It's basically like a big 4-pronged fork that you can loosen up your soil with. You can do the same thing as you saw over here, just using a post driver, creating a hole for a single plant and putting it in there. So there are ways to adopt minimal impact soil disruption when you're planting your things. So our final stop is going to be in the far corner of the farm, and we're going to check out our compost pile and talk a little bit about that. And compost tends to be a really easy technique to adopt for a home gardener. So we're gonna make our way over that way. But I think while we have this really nice view of the farm, we can talk a little bit about water, which is another big point in sustainability. So if you can kind of see these edges of the farm is situated in a bit of a bowl, and it essentially acts as a big sieve for water. So because the edges of the farm slope inward, and we're in like a little bit of a shallow bowl on this piece of land, the water that comes from the rain whenever there's a storm can be easily held onto by the soil here, which means that we get to water less and we get to use less of that resource, which is precious, and farming does take a lot of water, as you've probably seen in your garden. So that's another big sustainability piece, which is actually really just facilitated by the environment that we happen to be in. We have our chickens. They're a sustainability piece too. They eat a lot of our weeds, so less things to send out onto the curb for pickup or anything like that. They go into the chickens and they are happy about it, and it benefits us. So we've got a lot growing over here. As you can see, we have more plants in the ground. And we're almost at the compost pile. So this is all the way in the corner of our farm. And it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but compost is kind of just that kind of process. Basically anything that we're done with, we throw onto this pile. So there's potting soil in it, there's some discarded crop in it, some grass. We tend not to put weeds in here because they'll seed, and then the hope is to put this back into the soil next year. And if there's weed seed in it, it kind of defeats the purpose that we're going for. So this sits in the sun. It's all organic material. It sits in the sun and decomposes over a long period of time. So a lot of the compost that we've used in the field for this year has been going through the decomposing process for a while, probably since last season. And compost is a sustainability effort because it helps to kind of keep a closed loop system in the farm. So some of our waste goes in here, our organic waste goes into the compost pile, breaks down, and then is able to be put back into the soil. And compost greatly benefits the soil by adding that organic material and those micronutrients and all the important things to keep plants healthy. There is a distinction between different kinds of composts, and this is relevant if you're going to be composting at home. There's brown compost and there's green compost. Brown compost is yard waste, so think of decaying leaves and branches and things like that. Green compost is food and vegetable waste. And if you're composting at home, it's important to note that there are some things that can't be composted in a home compost pile, just like some things can't be composted here. So if you've ever gotten a CSA share with us or a Healthy Harvest bag with us, we bag our loose greens into what look like plastic bags, but they're actually biodegradable, compostable, plastic resembling bags. And they're made from, what are they made from?
Corn.
Corn's versatile. So something like that can't be composted in a home compost pile like this. It has to go to a compost facility where they have more resources for breaking things down. If you are composting at home, using the layering technique to incorporate brown and green compost helps everything to break down. So a layer of brown compost, a layer of green compost, and so on, allows everything to break down in the same kind of home setup system. And another great benefit of compost is compost tea, which I'm gonna have my cameraman talk about quickly, so we're gonna switch it around.
All right, so compost tea is a great booster for your garden, but you have to be very specific and very careful with how you're actually using it. So So what is compost tea? So compost tea is a water-soluble compost that can be added when you actually start to garden and add more nutrients into your soil very quickly. So how do you get compost tea? So you can get compost tea by getting a very specific compost bucket, and there's a little filter on the bottom of the bucket and a nozzle, and there's a compost food that you put towards your compost, and as your compost is breaking down, it's going to create this very strong compost liquid that is then going to be able to be filtered out through the little nozzle of your compost bucket. So from there, you then have to water it down in a very strong dilution. So it's literally 1 tablespoon of the compost tea to a gallon of water. You don't want to get too excited about using compost tea, because if you add too much compost into your garden, you could like burn your plants. That just means that you're just putting too much nutrients back into the soil, and your plants actually just don't know what to do with like all of that. A good idea for like compost tea is just really monitoring when your plants may need an extra boost, and then that would kind of give you that sort of extra advantage to just spreading out more compost, especially in the middle of the season. So you just want to look for like that bucket where you can actually get that little nozzle. You can look it up online and seeing what that means for you. But if you're just home composting, just getting like a 5-gallon like bucket with a lid on it, and if you have the access to compost at home, you're simply just going to want to look for like a fenced area. Just put chicken wire around it, and you can literally just like dump your kind of bucket into your chicken wire. And then as Hope mentioned, layering it with like leaves helps you kind of break that compost down. And then you want to turn it every season. So in the fall and in the spring, you want to make sure that you're turning your compost just to again get that aeration in there. And depending on the weather, so if there is a lot of rain, then the nature will take care of itself just to get more of that moisture in there, just to break down your compost. But if you are getting a lot of rain, then you want to make sure that you are wetting your compost to kind of aerate a lot of that sort of dryness in there. You will notice that compost doesn't necessarily add a lot of or create a lot of volume. Everything is kind of breaking down. So imagine like big bags of spinach, and then you're sort of cooking it down, and you have this like little bunch. That's literally how compost works. You have this massive amount of compost at the beginning. Nature does its work to kind of break down all the composts. At the end of it, the compost should look like kind of like black gold, like or black sand. It's like very, very fine. It's very earthy. It shouldn't smell at all. And that's what you're looking for when you're adding compost into your soil. So with us, with our compost, this is naturally being broken down by all of our plant matter, all of our food waste, and then it's going back into our soil. So we're trying to close that loop with our sustainability.
So that concludes our overview of some of the sustainability efforts that we have here at the farm. And again, sustainability applies both to production farms like ours and to home gardeners who are growing their own food. Any way that we can give back to the soil that's feeding us is going to keep that soil productive year after year. And if you follow along with kind of the struggle of industrial agriculture and the weight that it's putting on the planet, we're losing a lot of topsoil. We're losing a lot of nutrients in our soil. And farmable land is dwindling, it's shrinking. And small farms like ours and many others in our area are doing a lot of work around how to keep this land viable for a long period of time. And if farms aren't doing this kind of work, if they're not using cover crops in the winter to keep the topsoil in place, if they're not rotating their crops to give the land rest, it's easier to see, and we tend to see, nutrient loss, topsoil loss, and just depleted soil that eventually can't grow anything. So any effort that we can make to get our soil healthy, whether it's a farm like ours or yourselves at home, it's a worthwhile investment. And seeing the benefits of healthier soil and more nutrient-dense food is probably something that any excited gardener would be thrilled to see. So I hope that these are useful tips. I hope that they're adaptable for you all at home. And as always, tune in next week and we'll have more exciting gardening stuff on Wednesday. See you next time.